implement the pieces of the Clean Air Act. So how are you going to do a permitting program? How are you going to do a monitoring program? How are you going to do compliance enforcement? How are you going to do planning? And then when you have a non-attainment area, it's an amendment or an update to that plan. It's a living document. And so it says, okay, you have this area that's not meeting the standards. Update your plan to show how you're going to bring that area into attainment. And as you guys know, that happened with the moderate SIP. That was actually fairly recently adopted by the EPA, so it takes years. When we're looking at the timeline on things, it was 2006 when they changed the standard. It took 3 years of data to determine that Fairbanks was a non-attainment area, even though everybody knew it was. In 2009, they finally submitted the SIP in 2015, and it was like 2018 when the moderate, or 2017 when the moderate SIP was finally approved by EPA. And so we're talking decades to go through all these different things. There we go. So as I said, the SIP's a living document. It's revised by the state as necessary, and keeping the SIP updated is a continuous process. For example, the borough, and we can get a little bit more into what are the specific roles of each agency, but the borough has been delegated the authority to implement a PM 2.5 air quality control program. And with that, the borough takes the lead on any regulations to try to reduce PM 2.5 emissions across a non-attainment area. And as the borough does that, the state adopts whatever regulations that the borough takes the lead on up at the state level. And then once the state adopts those, then write them into the SIP, and once EPA approves them, then they're in the SIP and they're federally enforceable. This is happening on a continual basis. It's not just, that once a decade when the major SIP revisions happen. So, for example, Ordinance 2015-01, which established the first curtailment program, that ordinance has been adopted by state regulations, written into the SIP, and approved by EPA. So that's now federally enforceable. That can't be removed. The Ordinance 2017-17 and 2017-44, which strengthened the curtailment program and did a lot of other things, those have been moved through in their state regulation now, and then adopted into the SIP but not approved by EPA. And those are continuously happening. So this was kind of a popular question. What happens if a SIP revision is not submitted or is disapproved? And this can be for anything within the PM 2.5 implementation rule that gets missed. So any timelines, any deadlines, or if something is not approved by the federal government. So if the state of Alaska submitted something that just wasn't approvable, these consequences can happen. The first thing they would start the sanction clock, and there's 2 sanctions that after 18 months they can either go for NSR permitting sanctions, which require offsets, or they can sanction highway funds at that 18-month mark. The federal government has the choice on which one they implement. At 24 months, if it still hasn't been fixed, then they implement the other sanction. And then there's all the federal implementation plan, which will be implemented. So instead of a SIP, a state implementation plan, the federal government, or the EPA in this case, would write the implementation plan and show the community, say that this is how you're going to reach it. So,
are the new source review permitting sanctions?
No, we are not. There have been no sanctions clocks started.
Okay.
There was once during the carbon monoxide days, and then the issue was rectified before any sanctions hit.
So we are at risk to start a clock on sanctions soon? Yes or no?
Right now,
okay.
But it depends on the actions of the local government and the state government, and it could certainly happen.
Gotcha. Okay.
At some point in time. That's part of our job, is to try to ensure that this doesn't happen. This is worst case scenario.
Has that happened anywhere
Yes, it has. I think New Mexico is one example in the 1990s. Where that did happen, and they took away highway funding, and it had significant effects on their highway infrastructure.
The federal implementation plan.
So the PM 2.5 implementation rule was issued in 2015. I can't recall the exact date. And it's a couple hundred pages of CFR, and it details exactly how a serious PM 2.5, moderate and serious PM 2.5 non-attainment areas should follow the Clean Air Act and bring it into attainment. And so it would much follow that to the letter. And the way that the difference between local, state, and federal control over these programs is at the local level, you can paint with a more narrow brush and you're more nimble. So you have the ability to, change things during a season. For example, the is able to change code in a matter of weeks. A discrepancy between what was available for the no ash or no other adequate source of heat and what's available in the for federal funding in the targeted shed grant. And there ended up being a gap in there because there was some differences between what it as a work plan and what EPA issued as terms and conditions, which created a gap. And you're able to be nimble and to solve that and to paint with a more narrow brush. When you move to the state level, the brush becomes broader, and the timeline is now months to change rules. With federal level, it's a very broad brush, and it's years to change rules. It would take years to get one in place, but then once it's in place, it's not going to change. I'm going to give you some of the differences. I grabbed a couple of these slides from EPA. They have some good overview on the SIP process. So the air quality management process, with all the different things that go into this SIP, we have a bunch of monitors out there that can tell you what's going on with the ambient air quality in regards to the federal standard. And so you're looking at monitoring. That goes into modeling. You have an emission inventory document, which is a huge document covering emissions from every sector, including the point sources, which are primarily your power plants here, area sources, which are a lot of residential heating, mobile sources, which are highway, and off-road emissions, which include trains, and they have airplanes. Everything goes into that emission inventory. And you come up with some modeling that, in an ideal situation, drives your planning process, which drives rulemaking, and you come up with your control strategy, which is your rack and rack 'em, backed and back 'em, and MSMs. And if you need to explain any acronyms, please tell me.
Please do.
So rack and rack 'em are reasonable control measures, and those are what's required for the moderate SIP. Back 'em are best available control measures and control technologies. The technologies apply to your permitted sources, so your power plants, and the measures apply to area sources and transportation sources. Come up with your control strategy, and then in this, I like this diagram because this shows how the Clean Air Act was built. It was built so that you have permits, and that's where you have your enforcement mechanism to control industry, and that's, looking at when major point sources are the cause of the non-attainment area. And so that's what the Clean Air Act was built around. And in our particular situation, because it's an area source, we're working out this key tool right here. That's one of the important reasons why it's taking so long to make some progress on this. So yeah, I was kind of jumped ahead, talked about some of the rulemaking and control strategies. And so what we're looking at right now, going from the moderate to the serious SIP, is to look at the best available control measures. Now, the difference between the moderate SIP with reasonable control measures, in the moderate SIP, the control measures sat with an eye on attainment. And so they were evaluated with what's going to help us reach attainment. And considered such as there was one of the voter initiatives was in to strip the borough of any regulatory powers. And so within that analysis, you could say that it's not technically feasible to consider to consider some curtail program or some other regulatory program because the borough didn't have the powers to do that. And so that's kind of the bar under reasonable. Under the best available control measures, no longer an option. And it's also not based on an eye towards attainment. The best available means you're having difficulty reaching attainment, and so it says you have to go out and evaluate every control measure that was put in place in any community within the United States, and that's what you start with. And you can, from that point, you can narrow it down to what is technically feasible to implement. The technical feasibility analysis is very strict. You have to put certain guidelines on it. There's an economic component to it where you get to look at the economic feasibility. It's less reliable on economic feasibility, and so it's more difficult to achieve. And the last one is timing. And so per the M2 2.5 implementation rule, BACM have to be implemented within 2-year designation or by the statutory attainment date. The statutory attainment date in our case is 2019. 2 years from the attainment designation would be, 4 years from the attainment designation, which would be 2017, like around 22. And then the most stringent measures are basically, you would get that same list that you came up for the best available control measures, and those would be the ones that you deemed were not economically feasible and couldn't be implemented within the time frame. For area sources, for point sources, looking at the best available control technologies, and those, it's the state that's looking at that, because again, you know how the tasks are divvied up amongst the agencies. State has primacy over all the permitting of the major sources, and this is something that's pretty much straight out of the SR, New Source Review Permitting. The top-down analysis identify all the control technologies that are out there. You do a technologically feasible study, economic feasibility, and then you rank the control technologies by their efficiencies, and you have to choose the top one.
How's the economic feasibility?
Yeah, the
criteria.
For the BACT, it's a much easier process to explain. What they do is, say for instance, you're going to look at SO2 controls on a power plant, and you look at dry sorbent. You have a total equipment cost to add that to your facility, and then you would have all of your annual maintenance costs and operating costs and consumables, and that shows the expense of it. And then what you have to do is amortize that over the life expectancy of the control equipment, which is typically somewhere in the 15 to 20 year time period. And then you come up with your annualized cost to control equipment on. Then that annualized cost, you go in and you figure out what your emission reductions will be. And so by putting this on, you can eliminate X number of tons of the pollutant that you're looking at, and you come up with a dollars per ton figure, and that's what it's judged on. And back when I was doing permitting,
most bang for buck.
It's
not
most bang
necessarily impact on consumer.
It's most bang for buck, but keep in mind where that's at in the top-down control analysis. Is go through and you figure out every control option that's economically economically feasible, and you'll rank those. And so you still have to choose the one that has the highest control efficiency. And if you don't, you have to either dismiss it on an economic or technical basis. And so there's a step in there where they have to choose the best control option. But working in permitting, and there's no threshold for this, and so there's no economic threshold that says $10,000 per ton is economic, and $10,001 is not economic. It goes on a case-by-case basis. I've seen state agencies that set that bar at $3,000 or $4,000 per ton, and I've seen state agencies that set that at $10,000 per ton. The other point I want to throw out with the going through these technical processes here is that it's on a pollutant basis, and it's not only PM 2.5 that's being looked at. It's PM 2.5 and all the precursors. The rules, you have to look at NOx, SO2, VD, and ammonia as precursors. And you can do a precursor demonstration, which shows that those precursors don't have a significant effect on the PM 2.5 levels in the community, and off-road those pollutants so that they don't have to go through this stuff, because this is a lot of work, point sources and for the consultants that are preparing this.
Sorry, so going through what you were, it's sulfur dioxide, volatile organic compounds, and what?
NOx
NOx was the nitrogen.
and ammonia. So NOx,
Okay.
NOx is NO and NO2.
Okay. For those who others.
Yeah. And sorry, that's why
Yeah, okay.
I live daily in the air quality world. So again, if I throw out some acronyms, please just jump in there and say, hey, explain that. And
Ed just had one other comment / question, which is to do. So we're in this daily, so you know the complexities of it, but and maybe you've already touched on it. But and it goes to your question too, when you're talking about the per capita or the enter, which is also in PM 2.0 wood skills. It's sort of the, I don't know how you call them, the end users or the beginning user, but you're looking at the economics of that. That's a lot more complex than looking at, and all of this in terms of regulatory components is then looking at the point source power plant, because you have so many other factors that come into play in what makes something economic.
yeah, that's absolutely correct. And another example to kind of show the complexities, because we're looking at the precursor analysis, one that's going to be included for sure is going to be sulfur dioxide, because later on I've got a graph that shows what the secondary sulfate forming contribution is. And so when you're at SO2, that means that the point sources, the coal power plants, are going to have to look at sulfur dioxide controls during this whole thing, and those can be millions of dollars. The power plants, GEA has some frame set turbines that fire on naphtha number 2. Those are going to have to look at alternative fuels. A lot of the homes in Fairbanks use number 2 fuel oil, which is sulfur. The salt content on that. I don't have those numbers on the top of my head right now, but it's up in the thousands. Yeah. Ultra sulfur diesel is down at 15 parts per million, and so those are things that are being looked at in the MAC. So mandate for use of ultra low sulfur diesel, just like what was done up on the North Slope and what's been done in bush communities, is going through this process right now, and it does entail a lot of complexities, not just looking at the technical capability of it, which means looking at capacities, but also looking at the economic side of it, and so looking at the elasticity of the market to determine, if there were a price increase of X amount, would that drive more people to use wood? And those, yeah, and so those
pointed that out to the EPA.
Those analyses are being conducted right now, and hopefully they'll be available to the public in some sort of draft form in the fairly near future. I don't have a definitive date on when those are going to come out with some more details, but when they do, it might be a good time to sit down with groups as yourself and go over what are the what are this process and what are the economic impacts of these. And so I have this air quality management cycle, and I really like this slide because it just shows in broad terms what the process is. In the upper left-hand corner, the EPA revises the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. That happened in 2006. So EPA designates a non-attainment area. In 2009, state and local governments develop plans and submit to EPA, which I can't recall when the moderate SIP was submitted. EPA approves or disapproves the plan, which EPA approved the plan in 2017. And so the state is implementing the plan, which we're doing right now, and always monitoring the air quality. Well, and then we come back around to, we'll through this circle, and we've already missed the first deadline. And so it's from moderate to serious. And so we're on another go around this chart. And each time you go around this chart and do another circle, the conditions get tighter and more difficult and just kind of ratchets down each time you run through it. So we're essentially on go around number 2. Go around number 3 looks like MSMs, which are the most stringent measure. Go on number 4 looks like a 5% rule, which is 5% emission reductions on an annual basis, and that looks really difficult to achieve. And so, we're working, and each time you go through it, it just gets tighter and tighter.
Nick, just out of curiosity, is it an annual average since we're seasonal here?
Yes, and I've got a slide on that where I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in detail. See how I'm doing on time. Yeah. So this first time, and I pulled this out of the Air Pollution Control Commission's air quality plan. And I just thought it was a really good graphic that displays on a local level that first go through this entire process. What did the local government do, and what did the Air Pollution Control Commission see as positive action? What did they see as sort of a step backwards? You can see that there's several ordinances in here that did things like the stove change-out program, get things changed out, and a lot of the red in here is when the home heating initiative was voted for, and so that takes power away from the local entity, and especially at the point in the moderate SIP, the state was not going to step in. They said it's up to the local community to figure out how to get this done. And so I won't go into detail reading each one of those things. But then, so through 2011, 2012, 2013, there were a few steps taken in the wrong direction. And starting 2013 and 2014, we ended up with a little bit more control over it, and we got some of these ordinances like that 2015-01, which started the curtailment program and also had a bunch of other control measures such as PM 2.5 crossing property, some setback for some of the hydronic heaters, had some installation requirements and things that, looking down the road, are quite helpful. More wood stove change-out program, and then after 2016, there were 2 more ordinances that were substantial. There were several other air quality ordinances, but 2 more that contained some more provisions to strengthen the curtailment program and add some additional regulations that we believe will help the problem. And so here's getting into the design values and what attainment is based on. And so up in this graph, we have a couple of different trend lines. On the bottom that's dotted is the state office building that has the historical information, and we have the in-core site, which is just outside the main borough building. Then we've got North Pole up here.
Wow.
And red line is where we need to be. So it demonstrates how far we have to go. Now,
That's only season,
it's
because you're not in winter in the summertime.
correct. It's only seasonal, but what these numbers are is they're a 2-hour average, and so each of these numbers is based on either a 24-hour average of the BAM, which is beta. It's a beta attenuation monitor, gets continuous data every hour, and it's 24-hour sample, or it's an actual filter rate which samples for 24 hours, which is the federal reference method. And so, per the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, you take every 24-hour period that you have data for, and then you look at the 98th percentile. And so if we had a program that successfully collected data for 365 days of the year, it would be your, I believe, 9th. I think it's 9th highest. And so you throw out the 8 highest and then a 9th highest. And so if you're doing this monitoring and in the winter when you have the problem, you record 30 exceedances, that value is going to be taken out of the winter time. There's also an annual average, which are to the NAAQS, and so there's 2 standards for PM 2.5, the 24-hour average and the annual average. Because it's a seasonal problem, it makes us an attainment with the annual average. It's 24-hour standard that they can't meet.
So, can I ask?
Oh, yeah.
Sorry. We were, and we'll get to this again, but looking at this, there's so many variables that come into play. Like this year it may be higher, but there's, again, I'm sure I might look at it when it's like the price of oil, like 2010, there was probably more burn because the price of oil had gone up. With the price of oil going down, there may be less burn, but also last winter was fairly warm. Right? I'm a health investor, so I burned more wood and less oil last year, but I also live at 1,400 feet outside of the non-attainment with a catalytic burning wood stove, so I get away with things that some areas don't. But so when you're looking at these, and you're saying, wow, look at North Pole dropped. To look at wood, the burns to the would change out to the price of oil, to what the weather conditions were, to all the other.
Can you afford to live here anymore and less?
Yeah. No, when you're looking at the planning piece of it, then yes, you take into account all of those factors, as many of them as you can. When you're looking at just attainment of the standard, all you're doing is just looking at the number, and that's all that matters. And when you're looking at attainment of the standard, but when looking at planning and rulemaking, it's when you take into account all those things. And the other piece is that these are 3-year averages. So each one of these data points, since the 2014 up here in North Pole, that represents the 3-year average of the 98th percentile of 2012, 2013, and 2014. Of those peaks and valleys and annual fluctuations that you had mentioned, they're a little bit muted in this in trends because they are 3-year averages. And then, you'll notice down here, and this is where the borough and primarily DEC are, pushing back against EPA. This, for instance, Fairbanks is close to showing attainment with the standard. And so we have the 24-hour in-core design value right here for 2016 is just under the line, and an average of 2014, 2015, and 2016. As I mentioned, there's 2 different federal reference methods used to get these numbers. One is the continuous sampler, which is the beta attenuation monitor, and there is a mass-based filter sample that just pulls it in, deposits on a filter. The filter has to go get shipped and weighed. The beta attenuation monitors in this environment continually read about 10% high, and EPA has been saying that because the filter samples in the past have been on a 1 and 3 day basis, that we have to fill in those off days with our continuous data from the BAMs. What that does is that takes this design value from just under 35 and raises it up to 42. And it shows that Fairbanks is in attainment. And the state has submitted a waiver request for the EPA to, allow Fairbanks not to use that data because it is biased in the positive direction. And the borough has backed that, and it's one of the things that are at EPA that we're awaiting a decision on how to do. Another one is that the state of Alaska has put in a formal request to split the non-attainment areas because of this discrepancy. So there are things on the that the state and the borough are trying to push back a little bit on EPA, but they're always caught down in the weeds. They're on the regulatory matters.
Benefit of splitting.
The benefit of splitting the areas would be that Fairbanks has a reasonable possibility of showing attainment by 2019, which is the statutory attainment date. And if you could do that, you could, Fairbanks may not have to go through the most stringent control measures or the MSMs. And that's where all except for, I think, 1 or 2 of the point sources are located. And so it, could help ease the burden on some of those sources that aren't contributing directly to these high numbers that you see over there, and that would be the main benefit. It's in the hands of the EPA. I would say that the split is tenuous, and so it's something that I wouldn't bet on, but it's out there. Point sources are major sources, so they're the power plants.
Like the 2 here, Fairbanks?
Yeah. And this just to get in because we've got an impressive amount of monitoring in the 15, 16 years I've been working in air quality. I've never seen a monitoring program that is as dense as Fairbanks. Typically there's an area this size, there would be 1 regulatory monitor, and everything would be judged on that 1 regulatory monitor. But Fairbanks has, and this is just pulled off of DEC's website, there's the 2 regulatory monitors. You'll see the NCORE, which is the national core for the state. Actually, and I didn't get the units up here, but this is PM 2.5, and then there's PM 10, SO2, NOx, ozone, and carbon monoxide. And so that's the monitor that has all the pollutants. You can see here that these numbers are in AQI, and so we've got a couple of different scales that we use. Everything that I was talking about in this chart is micrograms per meter cubed, and then we display stuff, or the state displays stuff on AQI, which is Air Quality Index. It's a 12-hour weighted average, and it's confusing because it's based on a scale of 100 is where attainment's at, and they made that equal for all these pollutants across here. Anyway, we have the 2 regulatory monitors, and then we have several special purpose monitors. These are lower cost air quality monitors. Their data quality is not as good as regulatory monitors, so they can be used to judge against the standard. What and for actual attainment purposes. What they are, they're put primarily in elementary schools to folks to see what is the actual air quality in a certain area, because we know that there are hot spots and pockets that are constantly shifting. And it just gives the community the ability to look out and see what is the air quality near, some of these elementary schools, which that's where there's a lot of sensitive individuals that are really sensitive to PM 2.5 pollution.
And again, Nick, what are the numbers?
Yeah, and so this has been a source of public confusion, and I understand why. We have a couple of different scales that we use. The is in micrograms per meter cubed. That's the actual measurement. That's the mass-based measurement we get for concentration. These numbers, these are committed to AQI, which is Air Quality Index. It's a weighted 12-hour average. It takes the last 12 hours of reading from those continuous monitors. It weighs the close 3 hours more than it does the 9 hours, and it converts every pollutant to where standard is equal to right 100. And so what this means is that when you say 55 up here, 50 would be bad scale, but on AQI, 55 means you're about halfway to the standard, so it's about 12.5 micrograms per meter cubed. Both scales are correct. It's just kind of like the difference between Celsius and Fahrenheit. The bonus of AQI is that you can look across all of the different pollutants, and that that ozone, the standard for ozone is 65 parts per billion on an 8-hour rolling average. You don't have to know that. You can just look across all pollutants and say, are they anywhere near 100? Because Banks really only has a problem with PM 2.5. They'll use this internally because we're just used to working with the standard. And again, this is just some more of the monitoring data. This was pulled from the North Pole Fire Station monitor, and it just shows the variability that we see in the hourly readings throughout the day at the North Pole Fire Station monitor. And so you can see, we had a bad run the last week or so. We were in stage 2 restrictions continuously from February 1st through the 11th. Preliminary data that came in showed that we recorded exceedance every one of those days in North Pole and for 4 of those days in Fairbanks. So for North Pole, what a typical day looks like is you have somewhat of a diurnal pattern, and you can see peaks up here of around 150 for the hourly. Then you come down here into the valleys, and on this day it kind of hovered around the standard. And then when we finally got that inversion to clear out and some of that to start, then that cleaned everything up on the 11th. And yeah, we should be running clean, at least while we have this storm and this wind. Any other questions you guys wanted to cover was the source contribution. And so Deanna with DEC had presented on this back in September. And this represents a whole bunch of work with the state and consultants and other agencies. Go to try to figure out what the source contribution is. The first step is down in here, and what they do is they collect the data on the filters, so those same monitors, except they're collecting them on a SAS filter, which is not only weighed, but it actually goes through and they have a chemical analysis to determine what's the chemical signature of the mass that's put on the filter. And they have data on these, I think, for 7 years worth of data during the pollution episodes. And so the numbers in here represent 7 years of data. And they run two different analyses. It's a positive matrix factorization and a chemical mass balance. And see for Fairbanks that the wood burning contribution, and there's a lot of data out there because there's this data for all of the different source categories. The wood burning contribution for Fairbanks is between 52 and 68% in those two methods, and North Pole is between 78 and 90% using those two methods. Keep in mind that this is only during the inversions and the pollution episodes. Next step is they look at the emission inventory, and so this is non-attainment area wide. This chart's a little bit different when you split it up for Fairbanks versus North Pole, and this gives you what the actual mass emissions are from each source category during the day. If we have an inversion happening. Then the final step is they look at a modeling component. And then with these inputs and the meteorological inputs and topography, they run a it's a photochemical grid analysis model called CMAC. It has atmospheric chemistry along with dispersion characteristics. And from the model, they turn on and off certain sources, and they determine what the contribution of those sources are.
What's point?
Sources are your power plants. That includes sulfate formation.
Okay.
So two questions there. So, go ahead, Ben.
All
You're fine.
Is sulfate separate? Is sulfate from all sources precipitating PM 2.5 on that chart?
Okay, on the right chart. Sorry, I was looking at the emission inventory.
Yeah.
To look at the correct pie chart. The point sources are what is attributed directly to the point sources, and that 9% chunk does include the sulfate emission from the point sources. And we have the sulfates that are from other sources are out here. And this is why sulfates are being looked at under the control measures, because it's a significant contribution. Wood smoke is still the primary. And the way that you look at these numbers is they would say for Fairbanks, during inversion, when we're expecting to have these high concentrations, wood smoke would be responsible for somewhere between 48 and 68% of the contribution. And so it's an exact number because these systems are dynamic and they're always changing. The evidence between all of these methods sets an upper and lower bound of what the contributions are. And for Fairbanks, for wood smoke, it's 48 to 68%, and for North Pole, it's 68 to 90%.
So, the emissions inventory are, if you added it up between Fairbanks and North Pole, would Fairbanks just be heavier on the point, lower on wood?
Correct.
Okay.
Here's the chart on the lower right. What source of the sulfate? Distinct from oil.
There's several sources of sulfate. I mean, you can get sulfate from heating oil. You can get sulfate from diesel trucks. And when you're looking at the air quality modeling and looking at those contributions, it's really difficult to tease out exactly what it comes from.
That's what I was wondering,
Yeah.
because you have oil and mobile, but then just sulfate.
Yeah, and I would have to ask Dee this stuff because she's the expert in this, and I don't have all of the correct answers for that. But if you guys want any clarification on it, I can certainly chase those answers down.
I was wondering how the primary locations are the state office building right here, and also you've got the fire department in North Pole and then the other ones that, but, you know, I was thinking about that, looking at the wood burning contribution, if that's where some of that came from, and I imagine people in North Pole bring this up, but that the location may be located more closely to residential areas that have a higher use of wood burning than, I mean, there are people who live in downtown Fairbanks, but the number who burn wood may be a low percentage.
Yeah, the monitor's not in a neighborhood or in a hotspot area, and in North Pole, it's in a hotspot area. And, yeah, we've definitely, had concern from the general public. And the way that has been done on North Pole Fire Station, last season, there was a, blank on the name of the study right now. There's a study performed by ADEC to determine the representativeness of that monitor. I don't know if I included any of those slides in here. I don't think I did. And so, what that, it wasn't speciation. The word's going to pop into my head in a second. What that study did is when they put several PDRs out, and they also did mobile monitoring, and they were determining whether or not the North Pole monitor was representative of a large spatial scale, so neighborhood scale, or a micro scale, so something that was influenced by a few houses or a hotspot per se. And the results of that study were that the North Pole monitor is indicative of a large area, and it is not influenced unduly by a couple sources or a couple small sources. Within the 1.5 kilometer radius around the North Pole monitor, the monitor was either the high reading or the low reading, and it was consistently in the middle and representative, statistically relevant area. So the North Pole, that's a representative monitor. That work hasn't been done in Fairbanks, and there's still the argument that, you know, Fairbanks monitor may not represent, either getting the wood burning contribution may not represent neighborhoods, and I don't, you know, that study was about $400,000 to complete. It took a year or so to do it. I don't think they have plans to conduct one in Fairbanks. And the other issue is that because the Fairbanks monitors have been put there, and because especially that, you know, the one by the Roe building is the in-core monitor that has all of those different pollutants, it's difficult to move those monitors. And anything were to happen, EPA would like us to see another monitor going into a neighborhood. We don't necessarily want another monitor to go in, not because we're afraid of data, but because of the costs. You know, you purchase the equipment for those, they cost around $120,000 a year to operate. And once and records an exceedance for more than 2 seasons, the monitor is a regulatory monitor. Monitors have to stay for the life of the non-attainment area and the life of the maintenance area. So after we go through all of this stuff, there's a 2-year maintenance period. And so you're looking at an additional, you know, realistically, if we reach attainment by 2024, you have to operate that monitor until 2044. You have an annual cost of $120,000 a year that's going to increase substantially over that time period.
Is that for each one?
That PM 2.5 monitor. The in-core monitor is more expensive than that.
So we have the ability to meet the mayor's decision on what buildings to demolish?
That's why the mayor turned over monitoring to the state. That's a state cost. It was, the borough was paying for those monitors up until 2015. and, you know, turn that cost over because they're expensive to operate.
I'm not asking anymore. Okay, I'll keep my mouth.
Oh,
It's just, you know, it's from a science sort of perspective and envisioning what the movement areas, and we speak of Fairbanks, you know, the city proper is really tiny, but the area included in non-attainment area exceeds the boundaries of the.
Oh, absolutely.
So that's why I was asking that question, but, I won't talk to EPA.
Yeah. EP was, EP was just up with, the state of Alaska last week, and they were just looking at that issue. There's been no decisions on it, and the rate that EPA moves, it's several years to make a decision, but folks working on it, and that's why I said, I ended up putting a bunch of slides from things that, we don't work on because there are people involved in this process. I think the last thing that I had on here was just a quick status of grants. And so I wanted to throw up some stats on the wood stove changeout grants we have, and these grants, for those of you who are familiar with the program, is so that residents can get some sort of subsidy to come in and change out their older, dirty device for a, EPA certified cleaner burning device, which will hopefully have the result of reducing emissions. So, history of it started in 2010, and it's approximately $7.2 million on around 2,000 changeouts and 400 removals. $7.2 million. That thing is almost entirely depleted. We have little bits of it coming back in just because we have differences between what was encumbered and what was spent, and when you get those little small differences coming in, we'll get enough to do another changeout.
Yeah, when you're removing, you're just taking out a wood stove, not replacing it with anything. Is that what that's about?
No, there's two ways that you can remove it. You can get $2,000 to just remove a wood stove and just put a restriction on and say, get rid of this, I want $2,000, and there you go. You can also replace it with a cleaner burning alternative, such as fuel oil, natural gas, propane, district heat. And when you do one of those, the incentive levels vary based on the emission reduction. So if natural gas was available and you wanted to go into natural gas and you wanted to change out your stove, you could get up to $10,000. Sign a deed restriction, and then we count it as a removal because that device has been removed.
And I'm sorry for the deed restriction just means that for the life of that you own the house, or for the house, I guess? For
the life of the house.
Okay.
The deed restriction transfers with property sale.
Okay, thank you.
And the state and local funding is pretty much depleted, but we have this 2016 Targeted Airshed Grant, which was a $2.3 million award. We got that notified last summer and actually got it in place and started spending money in September 2017. What we get to spend on changeouts after grant administration fees is about $2 million. We're projected to change out 497 devices and remove 35 devices based on historical information with that grant. And currently we have $1.9 million remaining. We have 57 changeouts in various steps of, the application of actually getting accepted and encumbered and so on and so forth. And so we're on target to move through that money. The life of the grant is 4 years, and I think there's going to be any problem spending that. The 2017 Targeted Airshed Grant is a $4 million ask. This is for conversions only. And this would be no wood-to-wood changeouts. It would have to be for natural gas, fuel oil, propane, with looking at where we're sitting at and where we need to be, focusing on just getting those devices out is what we feel is going to be most beneficial.
When will you know on that?
We'll probably get be final word on that some in April.
And then what's the high end and what's the low end?
The high end and low end, I might have a copy of that. I'll have to look at the
Is
number.
it similar to the woods?
Similar to the wood stove, the incentives are higher, which is why we're only projecting to do 480 devices instead of 497.
Per device.
It is, so we do, that's cost breakdown. Yeah, I'd have to look at this a little bit more, but, you know, it varies from $6,000 up to, I think, $14,000 is the high end. Yeah, the 14,000 would be for changing out a hydronic heater for a natural gas device. That's the best that we could do, and that's where you would get the most incentives.
What's that work out to dollars per ton? That given earlier.
You know, I haven't done that calculation yet, but it would be interesting to look at some of the devices that come in. Actually, we did calculation based on the entire program, and the dollars per ton is incredibly expensive. For solid fuel burning appliances, so for conversions, the number is $64,245 per ton.
Over the next 10 years or 20 years or?
Yeah, and for, actually, I can't remember if this was amortized or not. This was done quickly and done in as a rigorous fashion. And because the incentives are higher to go to a gas or oil appliance, the number is $88,000 a ton to reduce those emissions. So what we're doing with the voluntary programs and these grants is, you know, it's less cost effective than, say, putting on controls at a power plant.
Gotcha.
And you would just, you notice that the programs for the targeted airshed grants are more strict as you go, or I mean, they change to show more emissions. So in order to be eligible for additional targeted airshed grants, you have to show additional reduction of emissions, and that's why the 2017 is no wood-to-wood change-outs. We got funding for that. That's the way. So the next step is conversions. If we were to go again, there would have to be an application that would be, you know, showing even more additional emission reductions.
And the time to start thinking about the 2018 targeted airshed grant will be fairly soon, where we think about what, you know, what the application is going to look like, and then it'll be due in October, and then get the funding the following September.
Are there the EPA grants that the borough is applying for?
Yeah, and technically the borough does not apply for them. The state of Alaska is eligible for them, not the borough. So the borough writes the grant application. It goes through the state of Alaska. State of Alaska submits it, awarded the grant. It goes through the Department of Commerce, administers it to the borough. Grants are fun. And some of the other grants that the air quality program had funded over 50% on grants. The grants are they were primarily CMAQ grants, and so they were federal highway fund grants, and the purpose of them was to start the air quality control program. And most grants are starting to run out. We're going to see an increase this year in just the air quality's budget to keep the same exact services and keep everything flat at what we do. We're running out of about $186,000 in grant funding this year, and next year we're going to run out of all of our state and federal grants to start up the program. So this is for staff salary, advertising, equipment, education outreach, consulting support, and at the end of 2019, it's going to be an additional about $300,000 and some that the borough needs to come up with just to keep the same level of services, because those grants are expiring, and there's no additional grant money out there that we can get for the operation and administering still seeing, some good numbers come in through the, EPA on the targeted airshed grant. Those are not being used for operation of the program. And I think, it's 9 o'clock already.
So it would be about $300,000 to maintain the program.
$300,000 in addition to what they already fund. The program runs on about a budget of $680,000 a year.
So about $1 million.
The total. So the total is about 5, and previously grant funding had been paying for around 300,000 of it.
Oh, okay.
So the total would be around the 650 to 700,000.
Do you have questions if people have time to stay, or do you need to get going?
I have another meeting that I have to do by 9:30.
Okay. Well, put the slide deck online, and people can reach out if they have questions. Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. All right. Well, thanks for coming. This was super helpful for me. So thanks for the.
Thanks for inviting me, and we certainly like to be able to get with the members of the community to disseminate this information, because we're living in it day to day, but it does have some significant economic impacts on the community, and I think those are important there.
Where in the air pollution control commission?
The Air Pollution Control Commission is required to meet on a quarterly basis. They've been meeting more often recently. Those dates are typically announced 2 to 4 weeks out. We try to meet at the JHAC assembly chambers, but it's not always available, so sometimes we'll be over at the Fairbanks City Hall or, some places. I think the next meeting is scheduled for March 20th in the assembly chambers.
Which will discuss this kind of information.
The next APCC meeting is going to be a variance hearing, and so all we're going to be doing is it's a quasi-judicial format, and we have to go through a variance. Yeah, and be doing more of that in the near future. Try to discuss these at the APCC meeting when we have time.
And if you have specific questions you'd like to discuss in this format, let me know, and we can work on getting Nick back.
Yep.
Good deal.
Thank you.
All right. Yep. Thanks for your time.
Next week we have Bo York from Hillcorp. He's the North Slope Operations Manager, and also from Fairbanks. For Hillcorp, we'll be here at 8 a.m. So we hope to see you then.
Thanks for hosting.